Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined by Bryant, Burnette, and we are talking about Nightmares in the Sky, which is a mostly photography book by F. Stop Fitzgerald with King writing about gargoyles. Bryant, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm worried about all these gargoyles that see us.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I saw this and I didn't really believe it was real when I first came across it, but here we are.
Yeah, it's an interesting little corner of the unexplored Kingverse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things about this is King literally just admits that he doesn't really know anything about gargoyles and didn't do any research before writing these like 30 pages on it. And so he just ends up talking about Gargoyles, the movie.
Yeah, he's an honest guy. Give him that.
Yeah, but you took on the task of watching the Gargoyles movie. What did you glean from that?
That it's complete garbage, I think would be the way that I would go. But I'm kind of glad that I saw it because I first read this book maybe 10 years ago and
Okay.
kind of felt like, hey, that's a movie I should check out one of these days. So it's been crossed off the list. One of the things that was interesting about it, and King doesn't mention this in his essay, is it stars a very, very young Scott Glenn, which was
Oh,
kind of
okay.
interesting. I'd never seen him that young. That is not reason enough to watch this movie, but hey, if you've got Tubi, it's on Tubi, so check it out.
Maybe? Question mark?
Yeah, don't.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a few Gargoyles movies. I don't know if they're all necessarily related, but there's some from like the 90s and like the mid to late 2000s. It's a very interesting vibe. And I think, there's something to be said about gargoyles in general, but I think, with the way that King writes about them, it's just kind of comedic, or at least it was for me. And then I kind of not necessarily quickly flip through the images, but it's like a good 100 pages of images and really only like, I don't even think it's 30 pages. I think it goes to page 30, but because there's still like supplemental images to what King's writing, it's really not all that long. Like I knocked this out pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's medium-sized short story length at longest, but it's an engaging enough read. I think people that enjoy Stephen King's nonfiction would probably enjoy this. I don't know that if you're the type of King fan who is really just a fan of the movies and the books made from them, that you would get much out of it. But everybody that's devoted enough to be listening to Chat Sematary, I think, would probably get something out of it. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about it is, I know you're relatively fresh off of a read of On Writing. Was there anything in this that kind of vibed with that?
A little bit, because he does kind of run through some of his process for writing this essay in particular. And, I should mention too, just a quick side note, this is a coffee table book. This is not like, a normal size book. It's pretty big. It sticks out of my shelf, and it's from 1988. There was an excerpt that was published in Penthouse because for whatever reason, Penthouse really liked to publish Stephen King stuff.
Strange place for it.
It's just kind of one of those really random things that I came across. And I will note too, do not buy this on Amazon because it's going for like over $50.
Are you serious?
I definitely paid like less than $10 for like a used copy from Thrift Books or something. So like check Thrift Books, check Powell's. I think I just saw a copy at Powell's for like $8. So don't spend a lot of money on this by any means. If you can get it for under $10, I say go for it. But anything more than that, it's like you're doing that at your own risk.
I didn't do enough research to have had the sense to actually write this down, but I know that one of Bev Vincent's books, I think it's Bev Vincent, it might be George Beam, but one of them went into some sales figures on this book and said that when it was published, the publisher, expecting a book with Stephen King's name on it to be a big seller, printed 250,000 copies, but it only sold about 100,000. So in theory, there's 150,000 copies of this sucker floating around out there. You should be able to find this thing for at least no more than $10, like you say, but maybe even less than that. $50, I would feel bad for anyone that spent $50.
Yeah, there's like a copy going for $65, and I'm just like, that sucker better be signed or something, because that's something else. It is not signed. It is a first edition, second printing, but yeah, I would not pay that much for it. And I don't know exactly what I paid for it, but I know I would not have paid probably more than like 15 max. And that's me saying that as someone who is a big Stephen King fan. You know, it was just one of those things where I have so many like large coffee table size books for like Star Wars and Marvel stuff and some other movies that adding another one, I was like, all right, here we go. And I have like The World of It, which is a pretty big book.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
And
I've got that.
I have a couple others, like Stephen King at the movies isn't quite as big in creep shows, but yeah, there are some little gems out there, and I think this is worth it. And honestly, the photography's pretty good too. I liked a lot of the angles and like the ways they were showing the gargoyles. So that was just a fun little thing.
Yeah, the first time that I read this book, I didn't, I was there for the Stephen King of it. I don't know anything about F. Stop Fitzgerald apart from the fact that he's got a funny name, but I didn't really get much out of the images. But when I checked it out again this time, I was like, okay, these are good. I like these.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of depth to this. This is kind of just like a nice little afternoon read or something. You don't have to think too hard, which sometimes, Stephen King books can get pretty dense, but this felt pretty light in comparison to a lot of his, short stories and things, and probably because it is nonfiction. But he's even had like some nonfiction stuff about baseball in some of his collections, and I'm just like, this isn't doing it for me. So I think because gargoyles are, as he calls them, nightmares in the sky, you kind of get that darkness to King's writing in this still that I don't feel like you necessarily get with baseball.
No, it's Stephen Kingy. And I think the idea that he's trying to get across is just, it's a simple idea, but it's one that I can see sort of getting stuck in your head, which is that, I live in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, so I'm not exactly surrounded by the type of buildings that are going to have gargoyles on them. But if you live in any larger city,
yeah,
presumably you are, and never think about it. So he's kind of putting forward this idea that there are constantly these creepy things above you all the time that you're not thinking about, but it's there. And if you do start thinking about it, it could kind of oog you out a little bit. And that's a cool idea. I like that idea.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up because I looked at the credits in the back of the book where all of the pictures were taken.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to college in Philadelphia. And the number of places in Philadelphia that were in the back of the book as like places where these gargoyles were, I was like, I cannot for the life of me recall seeing a single gargoyle. It was just one of those things where I was like, I was literally across from the University of Pennsylvania. I went to Drexel, and they kind of like mesh into each other in the city because that's just how city colleges work, apparently.
Right.
And I was like, I have walked through UPenn's campus plenty of times because it was a bit of a nicer walk than just walking down the street sometimes, or I would go get food on their campus. And I was like, I do not remember seeing a single gargoyle. And there were some that were like down on Race Street and I think Vine Street maybe. And I was just like, man, I probably walked by so many of these. And like you said, did not realize it, did not notice them whatsoever.
Yeah, and that's, if you want to get all hoity-toity with it, that can be a nice little metaphor for the unseen life that's all around you all the time. Stephen King might not approve of taking it to that intellectual level, but that's okay.
Yeah, it's something else. Once you realize it, you're like, oh, those were there the whole time. And they've been there for, hundreds of years probably for a lot of those buildings in Philadelphia.
Yeah, it is a cool idea. It's a pretty good idea for a coffee table book too. I'm a little surprised this didn't sell better than it did. It seems like something that should have been sort of a natural for Christmas gift giving in 1988.
I wonder if it was just something with the marketing or something along those lines, because it really feels like you said earlier, they thought because King's name was attached, it was just going to sell. But I feel like this is something that needs a little more marketing than a new Stephen King novel, because that's going to sell itself. But this, it's a little more out there that if people don't hear about it the way they normally hear about Stephen King books, it just might fly under the radar. And it seems like that's kind of what happened. And I mean, look, I was not born when this was around, so I can't speak to the marketing on it whatsoever. But it just feels like that kind of element, the marketing push element, was missing. And that's why, because you could ask someone who knows about Christine, Pet Sematary, The Shining, Carrie, the big Stephen King titles, if they've ever heard of this, and they might say no.
Oh, yeah, I would assume most people would. Which prompts a question I was going to ask. If you were making a list of Stephen King books, would you put this on it?
It made its way to the spreadsheet, so probably, but I think this would be pretty low on the priority list, especially with his nonfiction stuff, because you have On Writing and Dance Macabre are kind of the big two, and then you also have Secret Windows. Mm-hmm. I think this is something that is for a very specific King fan. Like, not a lot of people are going to want to necessarily sit through 128 pages of gargoyle photos.
It may literally be only for me.
And that is fine. I mean, I enjoyed it. I don't think this is necessarily a thing where you need to give like a rating out of 5 to or anything like that, but it's something that's just kind of nice to flip through, and it doesn't take up a lot of your time. And as someone who spent so much time reading King, the fact that this was quick was pretty nice. And Bryant, I know we said this was probably going to be a relatively short episode, so is there anything else you want to make note of for this book?
I thought it was cool to read the story about he and his son Joe watching the movie, because anytime I read anything where he's talking about, me and my son Joe, or me and my son Owen, so forth and so on, I'll think, hey, he's talking about the guy that wrote Nosferatu. He's talking about the guy that wrote Heart-Shaped Box. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But beyond that, no, I don't think there's a whole heck of a lot to cover here. It's just a nice readable essay. If you're interested in it and can find a cheap copy, it's probably worth your time. Otherwise, maybe not so much.
Yeah, I wouldn't spend too much time looking for this one necessarily, but I do think if you happen to stumble upon it at a used bookstore or a place like Powell's or something like that, definitely pick it up, or, flip through it in the store first and see if it's something you think you would want to sit down with.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Well, Bryant, thank you so much for hopping on this episode. I know this was kind of one of the ones where I was like, do I even know anyone who's read this? So I appreciate you volunteering.
I am here for those episodes to fill in where nobody else can.
Well, you will probably be back on at some point. I know the podcast has slowed down a little bit here now that I'm caught up with everything, but there's some stuff I have in the works, and we of course have Firestarter and Salem's Lot coming up, as well as Fairy Tale later in the year, so some new stuff on the way too.
Never much of a break.
Never.